Strategic necessity to counter Beijing's military ambitions, defend democratic allies, and protect the United States. Economically, they argue, relying on China for everything from rare earth minerals to critical medical supplies leaves America dangerously exposed. But critics warn decoupling could backfire, destabilizing global markets, leaving America not safer, but more isolated. Is this a smart pivot or a risky rupture? Tonight we find out in this debate produced in partnership with the Council on Foreign Relations. This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. We're in the New York headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations, our partner in this ongoing series of debates around global events, this time taking a look at something of a paradox that involves China. Here's the paradox. On the one hand, China is now undoubtedly the strongest rival to the United States economically, militarily, politically. But on the other hand, the U.S. is profoundly...
This is the pink salt recipe that took me from 179 to 126 in just weeks. You know what the best part is? It's natural, easy, has no side effects, and takes less than a minute to prepare, using just 4 ingredients that I bet are already in your kitchen. This morning, I...
dependent on China. China is our biggest trading partner, a source of so many manufactured goods that Americans rely on, as well as a critical market for the things that we do still produce. We are hitched to China through an amazingly complex web of overlapping supply lines. China is our biggest lender. Even our major public universities depend on hundreds of thousands of tuition-paying Chinese students who often perform super well. So China is the competition, and yet the U.S. seems wedded to China. Can that state of affairs change? Is that even a good idea? And what would that look like? What would the risks be in something like that? That's what we're here to debate, with this question at the center of the arguments to come. Should the U.S. decouple from China? Let's welcome our debaters to the stage. First up, answering yes to that question, I want to welcome Derek Scissors and Isaac Stonefish. And on the other side, arguing the answer to that question should be known, please welcome Susan Shirk and Benn Steil. So let's move to our opening round. Our opening round is comprised of formal statements made by each of the 4 debaters in turn. They each get 2.5 minutes, and I want to start with Isaac Stonefish. Isaac is CEO and founder of Strategy Risks, which quantifies corporate exposure to China for companies and helps reduce China risk. He is also author of America's Second, a book about Beijing's influence on the United States. Isaac, it is so good to have you with us here in New York. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And the floor is yours. You are answering yes to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China? Please tell us why.
Who in the audience thinks that World War II was the last global war? For those listening at home, we have one out of about 80 people. Who here thinks that the United States and China are going to fight on the same side, are going to be allies in World War III? No one. Who wants China to win World War III? No one. Decoupling, for those reasons, is a necessity. We'll get into the details later. The other reason why we must decouple is the risks of engagement now far outweigh the benefits. I myself was an exemplar of engagement. I lived in China for 6-7 years. I studied there, I worked there, I did the language programs, I engaged with the United Front and the Communist Party and the Ministry of State Security through various arms and firmaments inside the Communist Party. Now, under Xi Jinping, especially a late and bold in Xi Jinping, all of those risks have gone up, and those risks get borne much more on Chinese Americans and citizens of China than they do for the folks in the audience. But understanding that the way that we've engaged as students, as businesses, the idea of potential win-win, that's all way out the door. Even 5-10 years ago, the people in the US government would joke that win-win means China wins twice. It's worse now. I'll end, and I like leaving some time and leaving stage early. There's a Chinese proverb, 螳臂当车, which means a praying mantis waving its arms in front of the chariot. And to hold that image in your head, picture this little creature delighted by its seeming power and then getting crushed by fate. If this is the direction that the world is going in, then regardless of how we debate these issues, how we structure our engagements, it's not something we can overcome. If there will be a war, the war will happen despite any of our entreaties or our nonprofits or our business dealings or our lobbying. And if that's the reality that we're getting into, we have to be prepared. Thank you.
Next up, I want to welcome Benn Steil. Ben is a senior fellow and director of international economics here at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also lead writer on their geographics blog and creator of several web-based interactives tracking global economic trends. Ben, also for you. You didn't have to go very far to travel, but it's great to have you on the stage with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John.
You are answering no to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China? Here's your chance to tell us why.
Ladies and gentlemen, we on this side of the stage strongly believe that decoupling is a man-made disaster of epic proportions, Brexit on steroids, as it were. It will undermine the U.S. economy, undermine U.S. leadership, and undermine U.S. national security. Because of the decoupling program on which we are now entering, over the coming months and beyond, prices in the United States and interest rates are going to be materially higher than they should be, and investment and employment is going to be lower. And looking out longer term, decoupling is going to undermine the special status of the US dollar internationally, a status that President Trump has pledged to defend. Some numbers to illustrate what the folly that we're heading into right now. If you go back to President Trump's first term, he bailed out American farmers hit by retaliatory tariffs from China to the tune of $61 billion. That $61 billion represented 92% of the total tariffs which we collected from imports from China. And 100% of those tariffs were paid by American firms. So we did not.
Hello, my name is Adam Ferrari, the Chief Executive Officer of Phoenix Energy. I look forward to you joining us at our next investor webinar, where you can drill deeper into our 9 to 13% annual interest rate bond offerings and see how our company has become an emerging leader in the oil and gas industry. In 2024, Phoenix Energy rose to become the 11th most prolific oil and gas operator in the Williston Basin, one of America's top producing regions. We are now right alongside industry giants like ConocoPhillips and EOG and plan to continue rising in the rankings. Our daily production rates have risen as high as 18,000 barrels of oil per day. We've sold more than 4 million barrels, and we're just getting started. We hope to see you at our brief webinar. In less than 1 hour, you will learn more about our 9 to 13% annual interest rate bond offerings and the U.S. oil and gas sector. These Regulation D 506E bond offerings are open to accredited investors. Our team will guide you through the details of how to get started. Sign up for the webinar and start your journey with Phoenix Energy today.
Mom jeans. She passed them down to you. But who passed them to her? Let Ancestry help you piece together your story with a family history membership and detailed DNA results. Get started today at Ancestry.
Benefit at all from this. Another number that you should always bear in mind, nearly half of the imports that we take in from China are intermediate goods, which are absolutely vital to US competitiveness internationally, and therefore also vital to maintaining the primacy and readiness of the US military. Now, for years now, the prospect of a global decoupling from China, that is the United States and its allies combining to isolate China economically, has acted as an extremely effective deterrent, limiting China's aggressive behavior in the Asia Pacific. Now that the United States is treating its allies as adversaries and is firing all its economic ammunition unilaterally, we are making it more likely that we will have conflict with China in the region, because China is likely to calculate that the incremental costs of military conflict with the United States today are materially lower than what it will be in the future. For all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we on this side of this stage oppose decoupling. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Next up, to give his opening statement in answering yes to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China, I want to welcome Derek Scissors. Derek is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and chief economist of the China Beige Book, as well as the author of the China Global Investment Tracker. Derek, thank you for making the trip up from D.C. to join us. It's great to have you here. And you are answering yes to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China?
Probably the most important thing I'm going to do right now is say Ben is misleading you. President Trump does not want to decouple from China. He has never wanted to decouple from China. He wants to make a deal with China. In particular, he wants the U.S. to export more to China and therefore, in a sense, depend more on China. So just to get that straight, we are not on the Trump side here at all. If anything, they are on the Trump side, but we'll probably argue over that. I want to describe two economies quickly. One is economy C, one is economy D. And this is the background for my points throughout the debate. Economy C reported GDP growth of 2.9%, D was 4.5%. Household net worth in economy C grew 8%, D it grew 11%. Okay, D seems better, but they both seem like they're doing pretty well. Let's take a step down. The ratio of wealth of the top 1% to the bottom 50% in economy C is 5.5 to 1. It's kind of stunning. In D, it's 3.6 to 1. Not great either, but better than C. Labor force participation in C is 62.5%. In D, it's 67.2%. Manufacturing employment in C, this is giving it away for Ben, 12.9 million. In D, it's 17.2 million. Patent applications in C are flat. Patent applications in D rose 12%. The budget deficit in C is 6.3% of GDP. D runs a surplus of 0.7% of GDP. Economy C is the US in 2023. Economy D, for decoupled, is the US in 1998. 1998 was the last year before we started to feel the effects of China's WTO entry, because in 1999 we let China in the WTO and production began moving. Before we started to feel the effects of China's WTO entry, we were a much stronger, healthier economy. Now I realize that technological change has improved matters for people in the last 25 years, and China's a part of that, although I'll argue that it's a harmful part of it as well. But I would argue that as a society, we were better off 25 years ago. And if we can't go back in time 25 years, we can at least try to identify what caused the weaknesses in our economy, which have had profound social and political weaknesses. One of those major causes, not the only one of those major causes is tying ourselves too closely to China. When we were less tied to China, and it was possible, it was only 25 years ago, we had more manufacturing employment, we had less wealth inequality, we were not spending ourselves into oblivion. That was a better America.
Thank you, Derek. And now I want to welcome Susan Shirk. Susan is a research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, as well as Director Emeritus of its 21st Century China Center. She's also the author of Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. Susan, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Good. Susan, you're answering no to the question, should we decouple from China? Here's your chance, please, to tell us why.
Great. So I think we all probably agree that China has been overreaching and that China has become more of an economic and security threat. But the answer to that challenge is not to decouple from China, and decoupling is a losing strategy. One reason that we believe that is because China is much better prepared for decoupling than the United States is. Xi Jinping has been fireproofing the Chinese economy ever since he came into power in 2012 in order to reduce its vulnerability to what he believes is a long-term effort by the United States to contain China's economic development.
As a professional mechanic, your tools are essential for your living. Icon tools complete every repair without giving an inch. With broad selection and industry-leading warranty, you can count on Icon. You can count on great value. With over 1,500 stores and interest-free credit on qualifying purchases, why pay tool truck prices? Go with Icon Tools. Tool truck quality, unbeatable value, only at Harbor Freight.
However you book, first check Kayak to compare car rental sites and prices to find a great deal on exactly what you're looking for.
So it has reduced its dependence on exports overall, and particularly to the United States. Today, only 14% of Chinese exports come to the United States, compared to 16% for ASEAN and 48% to Belt and Road countries. It has rerouted its exports through other countries like Vietnam and Mexico instead of sending them directly to developed markets like the United States. China has also been motivated by U.S. steps toward decoupling to go back to self-reliance, especially in the technological domain, made massive investments to become a tech superpower. It has been able to create supply chains for high-tech manufacturing and tech innovation, all within China. And as we've seen in recent weeks, they also prepared a really impressive and comprehensive retaliatory toolkit that they could use in response to a trade war from the United States, targeted on U.S. firms, key sectors like agriculture, energy, and most important, an export licensing system for these critical minerals, which gives China a stranglehold on the American economy. They are irreplaceable, and China dominates, not just in the mining, but in the refining of these minerals and the making of Chinese magnets, which we've all learned a lot about in recent weeks.
Susan, I'm sorry, your time is up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move on to a discussion round now. Although, Derek, I want to say, when you were doing countries C and D, I was asking myself, where are A and B? Until I figured out you were doing, I figured out couple, decouple, CD. So it made sense. So we're going to move on to a discussion about what we heard in the opening arguments, but I just want to tell you what I'm hearing. On the side arguing that the U.S. should decouple from China, from Isaac Stonefish and Derek Scissors, I'm hearing fundamentally a sense that there is a presumption of war, or a probability of war, or a plausibility of war, and if that were to happen, that the U.S. would need to be already decoupled, but that at present, to the degree that there have been attempts to avoid decoupling and, in fact, engagement over the last 25 years, that the risks of that have outweighed the benefits, that the win-win that was presumed when China was introduced to the World Trade Organization never really happened. They also say that the U.S. has already been hurt fundamentally by the relationship that developed economically over the last 25 years. Their opponents on the other side, Benn Steil and Susan Shirk, are saying that decoupling is already happening, that we're seeing it in real time, that to go further would create a man-made disaster. They're saying that we're seeing the evidence of that the likely outcome would be an undermining of the status of the U.S. as a financial power. While they acknowledge that China has overreached, they're arguing the answer is more diplomacy, because their point being that China is going to be in the better position actually to come through a decoupling, that we were already seeing that prompted by moves that they've made in response to the U.S. even talking about decoupling, and that they're saying the evidence is on their side in that case. So I want to take to you, Ben, your opponent's argument about there being a presumption of war, and certainly we would not want to be dependent on, I think the point being very obviously we wouldn't want to be dependent on Chinese supply lines if we were to go to war with China, but that fundamental presumption that, I'm not sure if you're saying it's inevitable, Isaac, but you're saying things are moving in that direction.
A lot likelier than we think.
Okay, let's take that to Ben, please.
In the short run, there is simply no way for us to decouple fast enough such that we would be in a better position militarily vis-a-vis China than if we stuck with the status quo. Right now, we are fundamentally dependent on China, as is the rest of the world, for intermediate goods, which are vital to our military and not just to our private sector. As I argued in my introduction, the way the Trump administration is implementing decoupling makes war more likely. First of all, because we have completely alienated, quite deliberately, our allies who are not going to join us in confronting China. Secondly, we've shot all our economic bullets. We have nothing left to throw at China. Third of all, China, looking at this strategic calculus, is going to say, look, if we're going to confront the United States in this region, perhaps over Taiwan, now is the best time to do it. They have no allies. They have nothing left to throw at us economically. We're better off confronting the United States now than waiting for a future administration.
Do you want to go first?
So I appreciate both of your arguments because they seem to be arguing for decoupling. The idea of China as a threat, and more specifically the Communist Party as a threat, the idea that China is much more prepared for decoupling, and the idea that Trump's behavior is driving us closer to war does require more decoupling quicker. I agree if wars were just fought on military armaments alone.
Each of your users is unique. Their security should be too. Bitdefender introduces Gravity Zone Phaser, a groundbreaking solution delivering unprecedented attack surface reduction. Find out more on our website.
A pro doesn't carry a resume. A pro installs bathrooms, and the work speaks for itself. Get everything you need for your best work at the right price. It's in stock now at Floor & Decor.
That decoupling would be worse than if we stayed coupled and fought. But there's so many other aspects of war. Psychological warfare, political warfare, there's cyber war in this particular one. This is going to be a war fought by conventional means and by many other means as well. And so the idea of TikTok, major other US data infrastructures so exposed to China, and China not having that same exposure to the United States does put us in a much weaker place. One more point on deterrent. We have to understand that the more we push, the more it's a deterrent. I thought the news around Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan was backwards. I thought that was the opposite of provocative. I think the more the US shows its support for Taiwan and other countries in the region, the more it reduces temperature, as opposed to what Beijing says, this idea that they're so thin-skinned that they have to react.
Susan?
I think a lot of this comes down to America's allies and partners. And if China acts aggressively, actually attacks or blockades Taiwan or attacks Japan or something else, then we're going to want to be able to act very promptly to punish China, to push back. And we'll need to do it with our allies and friends. They're not going to move to do that now. So we should really hold our powder and keep that ability in the case of an actual crisis.
Derek, something else Susan said in her opening is that the U.S., even by talking decoupling, threatening to decouple, letting China know that we might want to do this, is prompting China to decouple on its own terms already, and that they're going to be better at that than the U.S. What do you make of that argument?
Good. I'm glad they're decoupling on their own terms already, so I don't really have a problem with it. It isn't true, of course. What the Chinese say in their, this is Xi Jinping came up with this some years ago, and it's been repeated since, and it's a good line from him, which is we want to be less dependent on the world, we want the world to be more dependent on China. So it is a one-way dependence. That's not decoupling. That's taking the high ground and saying, okay, well, we're going to be less dependent on you, but you still need us. Connected to that, it feels like the other side is kind of pursuing the politics of fear here, which is to say, oh, well, we can't do it, but we're not arguing that. We're arguing whether we should do it. You can do it better and you can do it worse, and it's reasonable to say that there are unavoidable costs. There are unavoidable costs. But the argument isn't like, oh, this is going to be really hard, America should just give up. What's the alternative then? We get into a worse and worse situation. That's absolutely the Chinese goal. The Chinese goal is to put us in a worse and worse situation. And the side opposed to decoupling is taking that mantle up. And I have one more really quick point because Benn is doing this again. We are not on Trump's side. Trump alienating our allies is not part of our argument, and it should not be used against us in should we decouple.
Can you strike that from the record that that's not part of their argument?
There is a beautiful Humpty Dumpty quality to Derek's arguments. Decoupling is whatever I choose it to be whenever I decide to speak. It's not 145% tariffs as Trump would have it. It is perhaps de-risking with a MAGA hat. I challenge Derek to tell us what decoupling actually is. What policies would you recommend?
You ready for that?
Oh, I am absolutely ready.
All right.
Ben, I was literally born ready for this. Ben says we've used all our economic ammunition, so I can answer that question and respond to that point at the same time. We should be taking Chinese firms which have benefited from IP theft. Now, I don't use the really big numbers for IP theft, but there have been over time hundreds of billions of dollars worth of IP theft from US firms, hurt US workers. Chinese firms have benefited from them. We should be declaring them illegal actors. No tariffs. They have benefited from a crime, and we have documentation. I have documentation on about 60 of these firms. I assume the US government can do better, although perhaps not this current US government. We should be not supporting our rival, our enemy, however you want to return them, with US portfolio investment. So US portfolio investment in the first Trump term set all sorts of records, 3 of the 4 years. It went up $800 billion while Trump was president. So that we could deny them capital, we could punish them for their IP theft. There are very strong decoupling steps we haven't started with. And I agree, one of the things we should be doing is working with our allies who are willing to work with us. That is part of a good decoupling strategy. What I don't, so I agree with them to that extent. What I don't like is the idea that, well, Trump did something wrong so we can't decouple, or it's too hard so we can't decouple. That's not the way American policy should work.
I just want to say, Isaac, you haven't had a lot of an opportunity to talk yet, so the next big round's going to go to you, but I just want to let the other side respond first.
Well, I think interdependence actually makes us more secure. It gives us the leverage we'll need in a crisis. If we give that up now, if we shoot our wad, we won't have it when we really need it.
Can you drill down on that a little bit more, what you mean by that?
Well, yeah. I mean, if China and the United States both need one another. There's a lot of cross-investment. There's a lot of flows of human capital and talent going back and forth, as well as trade. And if we really need to whack China across the board because they have acted really aggressively, then their dependence on us is going to be very important, and their dependence on all our other friends and allies. But we won't get our friends and allies to join with us now, and not just because of the way Trump has mistreated them, but because they really benefit from commercial exchange with China, and any kind of decoupling is actually going to harm them more than the United States.
I just want to take that then to Isaac, where I think Susan is saying that the dependence is actually a weapon in U.S. hands. What's your response to that?
The U.S. is far more dependent on China than China is on the United States. And
can you say why?
So you could look at student numbers, for example, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in America, 1,000 students in the US. We can look at US courts. US courts are far more free and fair to global companies, US companies, than Chinese courts are. We can look at competition in China, the treatment of Chinese businesses. Chinese businesses get very preferential treatments across various different sectors. I think the other broad point about this that we miss about decoupling is, if you put the question to people in China, let's imagine you could have free polling in China. The most innovative, the most creative, the bravest people in China don't want the Communist Party to be ruling China. And they also don't want the Communist Party to be ruling the world. And so it's just baffling to think about this idea of, yes, the Trump administration over the last several weeks and months has alienated America's allies and partners, but those are not broken relationships. Those are relationships that can be rebuilt and will be rebuilt. And the idea that because of the temporary alienation, these countries are going to take China's side in a global conflict, with some pernicious exceptions, Russia, North Korea, Pakistan, is very surprising to me.
But I think what I heard Susan saying is that China needs us more than we need China, and that's a stick that we can hold over their heads.
No. I don't. That hasn't been true for 15, 20 years. I don't understand. So
well, who needs most? Who needs who most is actually a rather difficult question, because you can look at the total numbers of trade and things like that, or you can look at the kind of choke points, the key products or the key services or the talent that really matters to one side and the other.
Xi Jinping is not ruling in a turkey like Mao was. Mao, who said that you can nuke everything east of Xi'an and let hundreds of millions of people die and we'll be okay. But Xi Jinping has shown a great willingness to put a lot more pain on his citizens than American leaders had. And so in some objective reality, yeah, it's debatable. In the reality that we live in today with the US and China, Beijing is far more willing to exert those costs on its own people than the United States is.
But if you look at the political situation that these two strongman leaders are in, I would argue that Trump needs to try to make a deal and to avoid decoupling a lot more than China does.
And so you agree with Trump on that?
I think that right now China has a lot of cards it can play, and it is damaging the United States as it plays those cards.
Ben, I want to go back to something in your opening argument, and then I want to ask Derek to respond to it. Just to go a little bit further, in your opening you said that decoupling has already and would continue to hurt Americans. To elaborate a little bit on that for about 30 seconds, and I want to hear Derek's response.
Again, intermediate goods are about 50% of what we import from China.
So those are things that are partially made.
Exactly. That they're fundamental to the products that American firms are delivering, not just to the United States, but globally. We've seen examples around the world of countries that have decoupled. Brazil has brilliantly decoupled from the rest of the world. You can build, and in fact, Apple does build iPhones entirely.
Harbor Freight is proud to present the next generation of Icon ratchets. Built with innovative split pawl technology for ultimate strength and durability. We're so confident in Icon's 9 new ratchets, they come with a lifetime guarantee. Superior in quality, more affordable than the competition. What are you waiting for? Icon G2 ratchets, only at Harbor Freight.
In Brazil, exactly what President Trump wants to do. And an iPhone in Brazil costs more than twice what an iPhone in the United States costs. Now imagine that we're going to introduce that sort of shock therapy to our economy, not just for iPhones, but everything we buy. We will be in no position to confront China at any point in the future, because we will be far less strong economically.
And yet, Derek, in your opening, you made the case that 25 years ago, before engagement with China over trade really began, the U.S. economy was healthier than it is now.
It was much healthier. I'm sorry I went through all those numbers, but that's the basis for this argument. Like, we have to have China. Well, we didn't have China. It wasn't that long ago. We had a much healthier economy. We had a much healthier society. I won't get into details, but some of the people driving our political process now are people I really strongly disagree with, who are empowered by the costs of the dislocation that China has posed on us. So that's a philosophical point, but I think an accurate one and an important one. A concrete point is Ben keeps trying to bleed us into, should the U.S. be protectionist or mercantilist? But that's not the question. The question isn't, should the U.S. isolate itself from the world? The question is, should the U.S. isolate itself from China? Now,
can you hang on 1 second?
Sure.
15 seconds. Is that your argument?
iPhones are made almost entirely in China.
Okay, back to you.
Well, I mean, the iPhone is not the sum of American existence.
I give an example, Derek, and you decide you don't like it. You're going to throw out another one where maybe there's some manufacture going on in India?
So no, I'm not going to devolve the debate into a debate over iPhones. I'm going to argue that like we were okay before iPhones got really cheap because they were made in China. There are costs. As you said, there are costs. There are more costs, as we can see in the weakening of the foundations of the American economy over the last 25 years in staying in the position that we're in. You guys are both arguing the politics of we can't when we weren't. We weren't coupled with China. We didn't need them. We didn't need them to be prosperous. And now you're arguing that, oh, we can't change this or we're doomed.
John, no, what we're arguing is that this is a losing strategy for the United States. That's what we're arguing.
Derek's essentially saying that if we had blocked China's WTO entry, they would still be some sort of adorable little Maoist peasant economy and wouldn't be bothering us. That is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
The rest of the world was going to trade with China because it was to their benefit, and we would have too.
So the increase in Chinese foreign exchange reserves for the first 25 years from starting in 1998 is entirely explained by their goods trade surplus with the United States. Like, it's the exact same amount of money. So yes, China would have traded more with other countries. The most lucrative market in the world is ours. The lion's share of the benefits was ours. They negotiated with us first because they knew everyone else would follow.
What do you think about airport security?
What do you mean?
I'm all in favor of it.
Okay, there you go. So get ready to decouple. Get ready for national security incentives and guardrails and requirements transforming your life. Do you want to take off your shoes when you go to the airport, or do you want to talk about this before 9/11?
I have absolutely no idea what debate you think you're at.
Perfect. I'll break it down for you. So 9/11, September 11th, 2001, the aftermath of that caused a massive increase in national security restrictions in the United States for a much, much smaller enemy. What do you think is going to happen if we don't prepare now to something that we can see coming and work on reducing our exposure? Do you think that when China attacks Taiwan, or when the US and China go to war, because iPhones are cheaper, you can jump in. It's okay, I can see your face. The audience listening can't see your face, so if you want to jump in, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll keep going.
I'm inviting Susan.
Yeah, well, I think that
that was very gracious,
there are a lot there are a lot of positive features of interdependence that we haven't spoken about at all. And we might want to consider those.
There's a lot of really wonderful people who work for the Ministry of State Security.
Not just nice people.
I mean, I've met a lot of them. I'm sure you have too, Susan. I think we're living in some sort of like economic, like this is like Econ 101. We're missing the political, the military, the social, and the cultural reality of this. If the question is decoupling bad economically, and that's purely the question, sure, a lot of costs, fewer benefits. If the question is, should we, must we, can we? Yes. Yes.
China has more than 150, it's the largest trading partner of more than 150 other countries in the world. So China is highly integrated in the global economy, as Ben said. I mean, even if the United States had not help support China to join the WTO, a lot of other countries would want to be trading with China.
Wait, Susan, we're going to come to questions in just a minute, but I just want to go to one other point. Susan, you mentioned in your opening a preference for diplomacy. Diplomacy with China directly? Is that what you're talking about? And what would that look like?
We're Phoenix Energy, a family-owned oil company focused on unleashing American oil from North Dakota and Montana. We've already sold over 2.9 million barrels, creating steady jobs for hard-working folks chasing the American dream. You can share in our success by investing with Phoenix Energy and get 9 to 13% annual interest through our Regulation D 506C bond offering. Join our next investor webinar to learn more about Phoenix Energy.
Apply now to become a New York State court officer. Applications are open until June 11th. Enjoy regular work hours, comprehensive benefits, and competitive salaries. No experience needed, just a high school diploma or equivalent, and no age limit to apply. Don't miss your chance to join the best.
Well, yeah, I know we've sort of forgotten what it looks like. Diplomacy with China is where you identify what you're actually trying to achieve. As, for example, we would ask President Trump, what do you really want to achieve when you make a deal with China or you decouple from China? You know, what are you trying to achieve? Then you, starting at lower levels, you actually bargain with one another and talk about how you can make one another better off. And actually, sometimes it works.
I just want to get a quick response from the other side before we go to questions.
I just want to say, I say this as praise. Susan is my elder in this field, but I am old enough to remember Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping is not those two. There is a political reality to who you're dealing with when you choose diplomacy. And Xi Jinping is not someone who's thinking, how can I make the Americans more comfortable in this diplomatic process?
And put diplomatically, neither is President Trump. This is a massive break to the way that we've done diplomacy in the past.
Oh, so, I totally agree with that.
And we have to live in that reality.
All right, I'd like to go to questions from the audience on the far aisle.
Jeff Hogan from Wells Fargo. I'm going to pick up on something that Derek said, which is you've been talking about the should, not the how, and the why. You're talking about the why, but not the how or when. So can we go into more depth about what does decoupling actually, I mean, it's wonderful to say we're going to make iPhones in America. It doesn't happen overnight. And if you do that for the entirety of the Chinese trade, how do you move it outside of China? How do you replace it? What's the impact on the U.S. economy from doing that?
And how long does it take?
And how long does it take? Let's get really practical.
Let's ask the side arguing for decoupling.
So I get the next hour, right? Right? Okay. So, you know, when Congress actually worked, which has been a while now, the discussion in Congress was, and Susan, I don't want to put words in her mouth at all, but she's referenced one of the areas, was what sectors do we need to separate ourselves from the Chinese from? Not 4. Rare earths, semiconductors, because the Chinese are in the semiconductor supply chain. Now we have an emphasis on shipbuilding for military reasons. That's going to be hard. Some of them will take 3 years, some of them will take 10. So I'm not looking for a full decoupling. I don't really care about toys. I don't care about textiles. But I'm looking for a crucial decoupling. The things that really matter to us economically and matter to us in terms of our national security. And the tools are, you phase the Chinese entirely out of the supply chain. You just say, if you want to sell in the United States, you cannot have China in the supply chain. And you do that over multiple years. And I could go into more detail, but other people should talk.
So multiple years is the answer to how long it would take. But Isaac,
depends on the sector.
We rank companies in their China exposure. Wells Fargo has one of the lowest China exposures of any major companies in the United States. And so that's your answer. Many major US financial institutions and other corporates have joint ventures with the Communist Party. They have close ties to other arms of the party. They have heavy import or export reliance on China. Plenty of companies don't. Follow the examples of the companies that don't.
I love Derek's response because he should really be on this side of the table. He doesn't support decoupling at all. He supports de-risking, but he's tougher than those Biden guys, right?
Okay, I need to respond. I need to respond to that.
You'll get to in a second, but wait.
That's diversification.
For people who are listening who don't know these terms of art, difference between decoupling and de-risking, please.
Right. To decouple the two economies, you do something really simple, like impose 145% tariffs, so nobody wants to trade with anybody anymore. That is decoupling.
No, it's not.
Are there other ways? Wait, I'm not finished.
But it's not.
I'm not finished. There are other ways to do it too. You could do it with import barriers and export barriers, but 145% tariffs work just fine.
What's de-risking?
De-risking is identifying specific sectors and specific products where you put up specific import barriers or export barriers. It is exactly what the Biden administration tried to do. Both this side of the table and that side of the table could easily propose ways to do it better, but it's not decoupling.
He's trying to take decoupling and make it a caricature. First of all, 145% tariffs don't do squat because we have not provided resources to Customs and Border Patrol. The Chinese will just transship over the 145% tariffs. There is no decoupling going on the ground that will last more than a few months. So that is a way to associate our argument, again, with Trump, which it's not associated with. I didn't want to take up a lot of time, so I stopped and said, hey, they're strategic sectors. Stop capital flow into China. If they're a rival, not even an enemy, why are we giving them our money? Criminalize their firms, which we have never done. The US talks about IP protection all the time. We have never retaliated properly against a Chinese beneficiary of IP theft, right? So those are the big things. It's not tariffs. I wouldn't primarily use tariffs. It is attacking Chinese capital and technology, which is where we're really in a competition with them. And it is much more, although supply chains matter, than picking out a few sectors.
Okay.
The sector argument is for practicality because I don't want to say we can snap our fingers and take away 40 sectors in a year.
I'm going to go on to...
We can't do that.
By the way, that was a great question and a model for a great question. If you saw what just happened as a result. Down on the aisle.
Thank you for a great debate, Bhakti Merchandani. You haven't mentioned human rights at all as a reason for decoupling, and a couple of years ago this was very important, so would love to hear if it's relevant to you and what you think about it.
Who would like to take that first?
I'll take it.
Susan.
It is really striking how little people talk about human rights these days. And, it's really kind of tragic. Although, based on my own experience in government, it's very tough for any foreign power to really influence human rights practices inside China. And we have not had much success, and we've tried all sorts of different things.
Does that make the decoupling question irrelevant to the human rights question?
Well, I think China's human rights abuses create an attitude toward China in the United States and other countries, which, we really object to China's human rights practices, but decoupling is not going to do much to help.
There's been so much, great question, there's been so much corporate facilitation of Chinese human rights abuses by both Chinese corporations and American corporations. And we haven't mentioned this yet, probably the best example of successful decoupling is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, bipartisan bill which forces US companies to reduce their exposure to Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where upwards of 1 million or more Muslims and others have been imprisoned in concentration camps. And the fact that we've so given up on the idea that we can exert influence in China on human rights, I think is a tragic one. I think also the gutting of RFA and VOA, one of the many, many reasons why.
Can you remind people what those are?
Our great friend Elon Musk, in his infinite wisdom, decided that gutting the US public broadcasters, Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, which are some of the best sources of human rights abuses, but also the situation on the ground in China and Tibet and Xinjiang, was the right government cutting strategy. And so the idea that we should both engage with Beijing but not push back on their human rights abuses seems to have it reversed. So the way to do decoupling is to call out Beijing, to push US companies to reduce, and US nonprofits to reduce their facilitation of human rights abuses in China. Very quick final story too. US nonprofits to be in China have to have party sponsors and party relationships. And so what this means is that some very prominent nonprofits have worked directly with the Communist Party and continue to work with the Ministry of State Security, which not only endangers the global mission of what they're doing, but puts their Chinese staff in great danger. And these are things that must be stopped.
Sir, did you still want to ask a question?
James Heimowitz, I'll ask this question in my capacity as an advisor to the South China Morning Post, which I like to think is dedicated to fact-based journalism. So I listened to your two gentlemen's opening discussion. First one you said was you compared C&D economies, but I've yet to hear the correlation why the codependence led to the demise of America.
All right, that's a great question.
Well, I mean, I realize I went over those facts too quickly, but it's their fault for only giving me 2.5 minutes.
We've seen people do it.
So, I mean,
I'm kidding.
the mechanism is clear. The first shock is clear. We've been talking about it for years, which is we transferred production partly from the United States, partly from offshore countries in East Asia to China. So we had, not that all the manufacturing decline was due to China, but a large chunk of it was due to China. It didn't occur after NAFTA. It didn't occur suddenly due to automation. It occurred right after we signed an agreement where financial institutions maybe represented in this room said, we need to open up China so we can invest more in China. We built more plants in China. Chinese exports soared. U.S. manufacturing jobs dropped. The U.S. labor force participation thus drops. The financial side of this at the government level is more complicated, and I don't want to take up too much time, but for the people in the audience who are aware of this, there is a relationship, I know Ben is, there's a relationship here between America consumes too much and China saves too much. And as the Chinese become larger and larger, and their savings are encouraged by selling to the United States and storing savings out of that codependency increases imbalances in the world economy. The Chinese economy was not unbalanced investment versus consumption in 2002. It became unbalanced in part because of its relation to the United States. The United States economy has also become unbalanced, which has directly led to part of our budget deficit. Bush runs up the deficit because we're losing manufacturing jobs he wants to win in 2004. The Republicans resort to tax cuts all the time. The Democrats, not as profligate as Republicans, but increase spending, again, always offsetting social harms that intensify with China's WTO entry.
Thank you, Derek. Are you good with my moving on to another question? Okay, thank you. Sir.
This is for the decoupling side. It seems that there are two very different arguments going on. One is entirely driven by fear of a war, and the other is concern about the economy. So which is it? Is it a concern that we do not have the capacity or the willingness to deter China militarily, or that the economic effects, irrespective of what China does militarily, are so detrimental that we need to decouple?
That's a really good dissection of what's been happening in the conversation. Why don't we take that?
So the two arguments are interrelated, but they're not actually aligned. So the military argument is the U.S. needs to reduce its China exposure, needs to do a level of managed decoupling or perhaps full decoupling in order to protect itself and for national security reasons. And I agree with the points that everyone's been making that while you do that, you should be moving closer to your allies rather than further away. There entirely. The economic argument is, the economic argument for decoupling is about fairness and externalities. Fairness I'll let Derek talk about. That's part of what he's been saying about his point about the 90s. The externalities is what happens when you are supporting Chinese competitors via your long decades of engagement in China. What is the price that we are all paying for a dominant communist party globally? What is the price we are paying for pollution from Chinese entities that are supported by US trade? How do we think through that? How do we structure through it? And then I think decoupling also can be done on an individual or on a corporate level. Again, so many examples of US and Chinese universities where you have 20 people from the Communist Party on one side and 20 people not from a government on the other side trying to have a conversation that is very party-led and very party-dominated.
So I'm very scared of a war with China. I don't think it's likely, but I'm scared of it, and I agree we should be preparing for it, and I don't think we are. But the econ argument doesn't rely on a war with China. It just relies on China being a predator, China being a malevolent entity. It's a cult of personality dictatorship. So I'm just going to very quickly, the comparison that Ben made to Brexit. Brexit is Britain separating from the EU. That is not the US separating from China. If you see China as equivalent to the EU, first, I'm never going to convince you, but also I think you're out of your mind. So the separation doesn't require a war. A war is scary, but it requires us understanding that China is in the current government, ruled by the Communist Party, is a malevolent entity. That's the kind of country you don't want harming you.
Other side to respond?
Obviously, and Derek knows this, when I gave the example of Brexit, I was referring to the economic effects of the decoupling. And I'm simply arguing that the economic effects of the United States decoupling from China are multiples of the economic effects of Britain decoupling from the European Union.
All right, speaking of the economic impact, one thing we haven't discussed is the fact that China holds an awful lot of U.S. debt. How does that play into that? Does that give them leverage? Does that give us leverage?
Well, for years, people have worried that kind of dependence of the United States on China holding a lot of our debt, one day they could just pull the plug, pull out all their money, and America would collapse.
Are you overwhelmed with identity management in the context of omnipresent threats to your organization?
Hi, so no one knows what that means.
What's happening?
Just explain how Okta helps secure digital identity. Keep it simple.
Like what?
Like when delivering a fresh uniform. Or viewing your results. Yeah, it's that. Or making Brad swoon at the high school reunion.
Oh, I love that color. Phew, that was a lot.
Oh, there's more. Like, lots more.
And as in the last few weeks, we've seen small changes in the dollar and in American reserves. There's no evidence, I don't think, that we know that it's coming from China. It means that everybody watching what a chaos there is in the United States right now is feeling very worried about whether or not those reserves are really as secure as they originally believed. But it does, ultimately, it's a kind of dependence that we need. I mean, we're not going to get rid of that. And that's one of the reasons, actually, Derek, that I think your proposals for cutting off capital flows to China is really a very draconian move of the sort that we normally only see during peacetime. So, I mean, during wartime. So, I think it's a form of decoupling which is likely to lead to increased hostility and the risk of actual war.
So just let me point out that Susan just said that my proposal to stop U.S. capital supporting China is draconian, which I think is reasonable. Whereas Benn said I'm not really proposing decoupling. So I wish the other side would get their story straight. I will say that on U.S. bond dependence on China, the peak of Chinese bond holdings in the United States was, we don't get monthly figures that are accurate, but somewhere between June 2014 and June 2015. And unfortunately, the real problem, we've borrowed a lot of money since then, not from China. So the reason the dollar is vulnerable is because of our stupid policies. But it's not the case that get back to your question, that we're vulnerable to the Chinese.
Right.
We're vulnerable to our own foolishness.
Right.
There are some relatively simple policy tools that we could implement right now that would cut our current account deficit with China and do minimal damage. For example, few people are aware of the fact that under the IRS tax code, a Chinese state entity investing in the United States in a portfolio investment, buying an asset like a treasury bond or an IBM bond, pays 0% tax, none. When you buy an IBM bond, you'll pay about 37%. That gives China an enormous incentive to accumulate US assets. That increase in our current account, our capital account surplus with China is then mirrored by an increase in the current account deficit. In other words, China has to sell us more in order to acquire the dollars to buy US tax subsidized debt. So I calculate, for example, that if we simply eliminated this anomaly in the US tax code and imposed this standard 30% withholding on all Chinese portfolio investment in the United States, we would reduce the current account.
Only Chinese, you think?
Only Chinese.
I have to call a wrap on time.
We would reduce the current account deficit by 16%.
And thank you for your questions. We have to move on to our closing round. And in our closing round, the debaters take the floor one more time and tell us one more time why they're making the case for yes or no on our central question, which is, should the U.S. decouple from China? And here to make his closing statement as a yes answer to that question one more time, Isaac, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to do the why and also the how. Why, we talked about military, we talked about safety and externalities. We talked about the Chinese Communist Party and the fact that And no one here, and frankly, probably vanishing few people in China, want to live in a world dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. Also, something we've never talked about is that decoupling is popular. And for so long, part of the reason we've gotten into it, yeah, I see that face in the back, not in this room. We are not representative of America here. Thank you very much. We are the self-appointed elite, and we feel very differently about decoupling that the rest of Americans do. Should we listen to the voice of the people? Sure, it's a debate that we're having right now, but they feel very, very strongly on the subject. How? How do you decouple? Use de-risking to decouple. The idea is not, let's eliminate every Chinese company from America, let's kick out all the Chinese students. That sounds barbaric and horrific, and I hope that the US and China don't get so bad that we have to get to a place like that. Rather, it's, you're a corporation. Look at the joint ventures you have with the Chinese Communist Party. Figure out which ones are likely to get sanctioned. Figure out which ways your joint ventures with Chinese state entities are supporting the People's Liberation Army or supporting the Ministry of State Security. Your university, you're petrified about the Trump administration coming in and cutting your funding.
Presenting the next generation of Icon G2 ratchets, built with innovative split pawl technology and backed by a lifetime guarantee. Superior in quality, more affordable than the competition. Icon G2 ratchets, only at Harbor Freight.
There's DIY, and there's doing it yourself. It's the difference between being creative and being a creator. Between a homemade recipe and a household name. Between a daydream and a dream job. It's your business, your hard work. You do it yourself. Create your website on Wix.
Cut your connections to various pernicious party entities before the Trump administration finds those and uses them as an excuse to reduce your federal funding. These are ways to do it. This is not only a national conversation. This is happening state legislators, universities, companies, but it's something that we should all be part of and we should all be discussing. Thank you.
Susan Troik, you are up next. Your closing statement as you answer no to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China?
So I want to use my last chance to say something about talent and human capital, which really hasn't come up enough in our discussion. The United States has a very powerful asymmetric advantage over China and in its global technological leadership, which is its ability to attract talented people from around the world, including China, to its world-class universities and R&D enterprises. Decoupling would squander this advantage, so choking off the flow of talent to the United States would represent a major national security risk. China has a lot of the top AI talent, and we need to attract that talent. People in China, as Isaac knows, right now there are a lot of young people lying flat. There's unemployment, they're demoralized. This is the time to actually recruit more Chinese to America, because when you look at the talent, the people who come here and get PhDs in American universities, most of them remain in the United States. They go on to become permanent residents, citizens, the same rates as people from other countries. So it's really important that we not decouple, we maintain the flow of talented people from around the world, especially China, to the United States. And that means let's not get into a race to the bottom with China out of nationalism, extreme fear of security threats. Let's become a better version of ourselves instead of acting like China.
Thank you, Susan. Derek, you are up. You've been arguing yes to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China, and here is your closing.
So I want to make an economic point really briefly. We have 90 seconds, and then I want to close with a moral point, which is totally unfair, but they told me to come up with something new in the last 90 seconds. So the economic point is there are a whole range of U.S. separation actions from China involving manufacturing, production, involving capital, involving technology that would make our economy healthier, would make our society healthier. And I can't go through them all, so I'm just going to ask you, you think about what would make our economy and society healthier, you're going to find out there's less Chinese involvement. And that's because China is a predatory economic actor under a cult of personality dictator. And I don't know how anyone can think any different. Xi Jinping, is never going to retire until he's dead. And he is not looking out for the well-being of ordinary Americans. Now I'm going to make the moral point. People think Trump is tough on China. In 2020, while he was president, about 380,000 Americans died of a disease that was caused by Chinese irresponsibility. I don't know. I don't want to say China is they didn't do it on purpose. I don't even want to say how irresponsible they were. They've lied about it since aggressively. They use the situation to their advantage in economics, in health, and politics. They've blamed us. In 2020, the stock of U.S. investment in Chinese securities under President Trump rose $300 billion. And if you think rightly that we shouldn't reward a pandemic originating in China with hundreds of billions of dollars of more money, you're already halfway to my side. That's the most extreme example, but it's the idea of our side of debate. You don't reward their behavior with economic engagement with the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. And Benn Steil, you get the last word. You're answering no to the question, should the U.S. decouple from China? Your closing, please.
A little bit of historical context to close. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when the United States set out to decouple from the Soviet Union, it was the easiest thing in the world because our two economies were never coupled in the first place. We set up our own global economy all by ourselves, allied with the 16 Marshall Plan nations and Japan. We accounted for 2/3 of global GDP after the Second World War, and none of us were doing any trading with the Soviet Union, so decoupling was simple. It's nothing like that now. Our allies today are deeply integrated with the Chinese economy. In Asia, for Japan, South Korea, and Australia, China is their #1 trade partner, not the United States, and they're not going to join our decoupling folly. Unilateral decoupling will undermine our economy, it will undermine our alliances, and it will undermine our national security. And I would also argue that it's unworthy of the country which, in the aftermath of the devastation of World War II, created the Marshall Plan, created the precursors to the European Union, created the World Trade Organization, and created the liberal international order of which generations of Americans are rightfully so proud. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we close, I'd like to ask the 4 debaters to come up and join me here. Not only so we can have a photograph, but so that I can thank them personally. I also want to acknowledge, first of all, our CEO, Clay O'Connor, who's here tonight and presides over this important partnership. Front row, round of applause. And we also want to thank the Council on Foreign Relations. We love partnering with you and doing these debates, and in particular, Michael Froman for welcoming us here tonight. Thank you so much. And most of all, I want to thank our 4 debaters. As I said at the beginning, we want to prove that people can disagree with each other and do so in good faith. We were counting on these debaters to demonstrate that skill, that set of values. And I want to say you all did it remarkably well, and we very much appreciate it and appreciate that we can finish a night like this with a handshake. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, we're banned. That's different.
Goodbye.